The air in the John Deere dealership hung thick and heavy, a curious mixture of fresh paint, vulcanized rubber, and the faint, sweet smell of new vinyl. It was the smell of progress, the smell of money. Silas Miller hated it. He stood on the polished concrete floor, his worn work boots looking out of place next to the gleaming green and yellow Titans that sat under the fluorescent lights like patient, powerful beasts. Smitty, the dealership manager, had the slick, practiced smile of a man whose sole dreams financed at 7%. He ran a plump hand over the enormous rear tire of a brand-new 4430. The tractor was a monster, a far cry from anything Silas had ever run. It had the sound guard cab, a feature they pushed hard, a quiet, air-conditioned bubble to protect a man from the noise and the dust and the heat. "Look at her, Silas," Smitty said, his voice oozing with persuasion. 125 horse on the PTO, quad-range transmission, closed-center hydraulics. This isn't just a tractor, it's an investment in your future. We can get you in this cab for practically nothing down. The Farm Home Administration is backing these loans like there's no tomorrow. You could trade in that old 4010 of yours, and your payments would be less than what you spend on repairs in a year. Silas ran a calloused thumb over the seam of his denim jacket. He glanced over at his 4010 parked outside. It looked small and tired in comparison, its green paint faded by a decade of Iowa sun, its fenders showing the honest dings and scrapes of hard work. But it was his. Every nut, every bolt, every drop of oil in it was paid for. "She's a fine machine, Smitty. No doubt," Silas said, his voice low and steady. "But she's more machine than I need, and more debt than I want." Just then, the glass door of the dealership swung open, and Dale Peterson strode in. Dale was everything Silas was not. His jeans were new, his boots were unscuffed, and he walked with the easy confidence of a man whose operating loan had just been approved. He clapped Smitty on the back, and his eyes fell on Silas, a smirk playing on his lips. "Still kicking the tires on that old 4010, Miller," Dale drawled, loud enough for the mechanics in the service bay to hear. "I thought you'd have traded that relic in by now. A man can't get ahead pulling an 8-row planter in this day and age." Dale had just taken delivery of a 4630, a bigger, more powerful version of the tractor Smitty was trying to sell Silas. He was farming his own quarter section, plus another 300 acres he was renting, and he made sure everyone in the county knew it. "She gets the job done, Dale," Silas replied evenly, refusing to take the bait. "Gets it done slow," Dale shot back with a chuckle. "You're leaving money in the field, man. You gotta spend money to make money. It's the modern way." He turned to Smitty. "Don't waste your breath on him, Smitty. Some men are just content staying small." Smitty gave a non-committal shrug, but his eyes on Silas held a hint of pity. "The offer stands, Silas. Land prices are climbing. Corn's over $2 a bushel. This is the time to expand, not stand still. The bank sees a man buying new equipment. They see a man who's serious." Silas looked from Smitty's eager face to Dale's mocking one. He felt a pressure in his chest, the weight of expectation, of a world that was changing faster than he was comfortable with. His father's words echoed in his memory, words from a man who'd seen neighbors lose everything in the 30s. "Debt," his father used to say, "is a chain you forge yourself, one link at a time, until you can't move." He shook his head, a final firm motion. "I appreciate the offer, Smitty, but I'll stick with what I've got. If I can't pay cash, I can't afford it." Dale just laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. "Suit yourself. Don't come crying to me when you're still trying to get your crop in, and I'm halfway to Florida for the winter." He turned and headed for the parts counter, his new boots clicking on the clean floor. Silas gave Smitty a curt nod and walked out of the dealership, the bell above the door tinkling softly behind him. The cool spring air felt good on his face. He walked over to his 4010 and swung himself up into the familiar, cracked vinyl of the seat. He turned the key, and the 6-cylinder diesel engine turned over, hesitated for a moment, and then roared to life with a puff of black smoke. It wasn't the quiet hum of the new tractors. It was a throaty, mechanical symphony, a sound he knew as well as his own heartbeat. He knew every clatter, every knock, every vibration. He knew what it was telling him. As he pulled out of the dealership lot and onto the county blacktop, he saw the reflection of the new 4430 in his rearview mirror, gleaming under the lights. For a moment, a flicker of doubt entered his mind. Was Dale right? Was he a fool, clinging to the past while the future passed him by? Before we go any further, I've got to ask you folks listening, have you ever had to make a choice like that? Sticking with the old and paid for, while everyone around you is buying new on credit, telling you you're crazy? Let me know in the comments what you would have done in Silas's shoes. Would you have signed the papers for that shiny new 4430? Or would you have driven home on the old iron like he did? He pushed the thought aside as he drove the 5 miles home. The farm his grandfather had bought, the house his father had been born in, came into view. It wasn't the biggest or the fanciest operation in the county, but it was his. Free and clear. As he pulled into the yard, he throttled the 4010 down, and the engine settled into its familiar, powerful idle. He looked at his hands on the steering wheel, the knuckles scarred, the fingernails permanently rimmed with grease and earth. These hands, he thought, could fix anything on this tractor. They couldn't, however, print money to make a bank payment. The choice was made. He would live or die by his own labor, not by the grace of a loan officer. He shut the engine off, and in the sudden silence, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow, he felt a sense of peace. He was on his own, and that was exactly how he wanted it. The spring of '73 came in wet and cold. The fields were saturated, and every farmer in the county was itching to get going. When a window of 3 dry days finally opened up, the race was on. From dawn till long after dusk, the roar of diesel engines filled the air. From his own fields, Silas could see Dale Peterson's operation on the horizon. Dale's new 4630, pulling a massive 24-row planter, moved across the landscape like a giant water bug, eating up acres at an astonishing rate. The tractor's halogen lights would cut through the twilight, working hours after Silas had to call it a night. Silas was pulling his 8-row John Deere 7000 planter with the 4010. It was a good planter, one of the best of its day, and he'd bought it used for cash the previous fall. But it was still just 8 rows. He had to work methodically, constantly calculating his fuel, seed, and time. He didn't have the luxury of an air-conditioned cab. The diesel drone of the 4010 was a constant companion, and by the end of the day, his ears would be ringing, and his clothes would be covered in a fine layer of dust and pollen. He felt every bump, every rock the planter's wheels hit. It was honest work, but it was slow. He was about halfway through planting his corn when it happened. He was on a long pass across the back 80 when he felt a change. A subtle hesitation in the hydraulics as he lifted the planter on the headland. The steering felt a little stiff. A knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He knew the signs. He finished the pass, pulled the tractor onto the grass waterway, and shut it down. He climbed down and checked the hydraulic fluid level. It was fine. He started the tractor again and worked the levers for the remote hydraulics. Instead of the crisp, powerful response he was used to, there was a sluggish whine, a groaning protest from deep within the machine's guts, the main hydraulic pump. It had to be. It was the heart of the tractor's systems, powering the steering, the brakes, and the rock shaft for the three-point hitch. Without it, he was dead in the water. The repair was a beast of a job. The pump was buried deep inside the transmission case, right under the driver's seat. First, he had to drain nearly 15 gallons of high-guard transmission and hydraulic fluid, a sticky amber liquid that smelled of hot metal. He saved it in clean 5-gallon buckets, hoping to filter it and reuse it. Every drop saved was $1 earned. Next came the disassembly. He unbolted the heavy seat and its suspension, wrestling it off the tractor. Then the rock shaft housing, a massive piece of cast iron that took every bit of his strength, aided by a chain hoist slung over a barn beam, to lift away. With the guts of the tractor exposed, he could finally see the pump. It was a radial piston pump, a marvel of early engineering, but now it was his enemy. He spent the better part of a day meticulously disconnecting lines and linkages, carefully labeling each one with a piece of masking tape and a grease pencil. Finally, he unbolted the pump itself and pried it free. It was heavy, dense with precision-machined steel. He carried it to his workshop bench and began the careful autopsy. Inside, he found the problem. One of the piston return springs had snapped, and a piece of it had been chewed up by the rotating cylinder block, scoring the finely machined surfaces and sending tiny metal fragments throughout the system. It wasn't just a broken part. It was a contamination event. A trip to the John Deere dealership confirmed his fears. They didn't have a rebuild kit for a pump that old on the shelf. "We can order one for you, Silas," Smitty said, a little too cheerfully. "Should be here in, 3 to 5 business days." 3 to 5 days. In the middle of planting season, with rain in the forecast at the end of the week, it might as well have been a year. "Got anything on a shelf from a trade-in? A used one?" Silas asked, a hopeful edge to his voice. Smitty shook his head. "Sent our last core back to Waterloo a month ago. Sorry, son. Should have traded this thing in when you had the chance." Silas bit back a sharp reply. He ordered the kit and spent the next 2 days cleaning. He flushed the entire hydraulic system, draining every drop of the old fluid, cleaning the sump screen until it shone, and replacing the filter. He used a magnet to fish out any stray metal particles from the bottom of the transmission case. It was tedious, greasy, back-breaking work. While he was elbow-deep in the tractor's transmission, the world kept moving. Neighbors would slow their pickups as they drove past his farmstead, their gazes lingering on the disemboweled tractor in the machine shed. He could feel their judgment, their pity. At the co-op getting fuel, he heard the whispers. "Miller's broke down. That's what you get for running that old junk." On the third day, Dale Peterson drove past, not in his pickup, but in his 4630, pulling a field cultivator. He'd already finished planting and was on his first pass to knock down the early weeds. He slowed the big tractor to a crawl, the air-conditioned cab completely silent. He looked over at Silas, who was wiping grease from his hands with a rag, and gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head before throttling up and leaving Silas in a cloud of diesel smoke and dust. The message was clear. This is what failure looks like. The rebuild kit finally arrived on a Friday afternoon. Silas worked through the night under the harsh glare of a single bulb hanging from the rafters of his shed. He meticulously cleaned every part of the old pump, replacing the pistons, springs, and seals from the kit. He used a micrometer to check the tolerances, his hands surprisingly steady despite the fatigue and frustration. He reassembled the pump with the care of a watchmaker, torquing each bolt to the exact specification listed in his well-worn service manual. By sunrise on Saturday, the pump was back in the tractor. He reinstalled the rock shaft housing, the seat, and all the linkages. He poured the filtered high-guard fluid back in, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and anxiety. He climbed into the seat, took a deep breath, and turned the key. The engine fired up. He let it warm for a few minutes, his ears straining for any unusual sound. Hearing none, he tentatively touched the 3-point hitch lever. The hitch arms rose smoothly, powerfully, with no hesitation, no whine. He turned the steering wheel from lock to lock. It was effortless. A wave of relief so profound it almost made him dizzy washed over him. He had done it. He had stared into the heart of the machine and bent it back to his will. He lost 4 precious days of planting, but he had won. The cost of the repair was $87 for the rebuild kit and countless hours of his own sweat. A new tractor payment would have been $300 a month, every month, whether the sun was shining or not. As he drove the 4010 out of the shed and back toward the field, the drone of the engine sounded sweeter than it ever had before. It was the sound of independence. The years that followed were, by all accounts, the good times. The mid-1970s saw an agricultural boom, the likes of which no one had ever seen. The massive grain sales to the Soviet Union pushed commodity prices to record highs. Corn hit $3 a bushel, then $3.50. Soybeans flirted with $10. The government, led by Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz, was telling farmers to get big or get out, to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. Land values in Iowa skyrocketed, doubling and then nearly tripling in just a few short years. For men willing to borrow, money was cheap and plentiful. For Dale Peterson, it was a golden age. The massive yields he pulled with his state-of-the-art equipment, combined with the high prices, made his loan payments seem insignificant. He was the poster child for the new era of farming. He paid off the 4630 in 2 years and immediately traded it for the biggest tractor John Deere made, the new 8630, an articulated 4-wheel drive monster with 8 giant tires and over 200 horsepower. He bought the 160 acres that bordered his farm to the west when Old Man Hemmings retired, paying a price per acre that made the old-timers at the coffee shop gasp. He put up 2 new grain bins, harvester silos that gleamed blue against the skyline. Dale was no longer just a farmer. He was an agribusinessman, a land baron in the making. His credit was limitless, his ambition boundless. Silas Miller, meanwhile, plodded along. He too benefited from the high commodity prices. The profits from his modest acreage were good, better than his father had ever dreamed of. But his philosophy didn't change. While Dale was leveraging his assets to borrow more and expand, Silas was using his profits to solidify his position. He paid his property taxes, bought his seed and fertilizer for the next year with cash at a discount, and put the rest in a savings account at the local bank, earning a steady, if unspectacular, 5% interest. He made improvements, but they were careful and calculated. He didn't buy a new tractor. Instead, he found a John Deere 4020 at an auction, the younger, more powerful brother to his 40-on-10. It had a blown engine, but the transmission and hydraulics were sound. He bought it for a song, hauled it home, and spent the winter rebuilding the engine from the crankshaft up. By spring, he had a second reliable, fully paid-for tractor, for less than the cost of the tires on Dale's 8630. He retired his old Farmall H, selling it to a hobby farmer for a fair price. In the eyes of the community, Silas was a puzzle, a throwback. At the co-op, they'd say, "Can you imagine the money Silas would be making if he'd just get with the times? He's got the land, he's a hard worker, but he's just too stubborn. He's leaving a fortune on the table." His quiet, debt-free existence was seen not as wisdom, but as a lack of ambition. a failure of nerve. When Dale drove by in his new four-wheel drive, people would nod in admiration. When Silas drove by on his freshly painted but still 20-year-old 4020, they'd shake their heads with a kind of sad affection. Poor Silas, still stuck in his father's ways. Silas heard the whispers. He felt the condescending pats on the back. He saw the new pickups and family cars in his neighbors' driveways. There were times, late at night, sitting at his kitchen table with his account books, that he wondered if they were right. He could have been farming 1,000 acres by now. He could have had a new house, a new machine shed filled with shiny green paint. But then he would look at the bottom line in his ledger. No red ink. No entry for interest paid. Just a simple, solid, black number. And his father's voice would come back to him, a steady anchor in a sea of easy credit. The land can be a cruel mistress, son. But the banker is always cruel. The decade wore on. The good times rolled. 1977, 78, 79. Each year seemed better than the last, but subtle changes were happening on the periphery, things most farmers, caught up in the boom, failed to notice. The price of fuel was creeping up. Fertilizer costs were rising. The news on the radio started talking more and more about inflation, a word that hadn't been part of the common vocabulary for years. One rainy afternoon in the fall of 1979, Silas was at the town cafe, nursing a cup of coffee. Dale Peterson was holding court in a nearby booth, his voice booming with confidence. He was talking about another 80 acres he was looking to buy. "The bank's practically begging me to take the money," Dale laughed. "Variable rate, sure, but so what? It's at 9% right now. Can't lose. Land prices only go one way, and that's up. It's the best inflation hedge there is." Silas listened quietly, a cold knot tightening in the pit of his stomach. He'd been reading the farm journals, the financial papers. He'd been listening to the news from back east. A new man was in charge of the Federal Reserve, a stern-faced fellow named Paul Volcker. This man was talking about inflation not as a nuisance, but as a dragon that needed to be slain, and he was willing to use the bluntest of instruments to do it: interest rates. 9% seemed high to Silas, who had never paid a penny of interest in his life. To Dale, it was the cost of doing business, a small price to pay for progress. As Silas looked out the cafe window at the grey, wind-swept street, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. The sky was dark, and the wind was picking up. A storm was coming. He could feel it in his bones, and he had a sinking feeling that most of his neighbors, floating high on their paper wealth and mountains of debt, were sailing directly into its path with no lifeboats and no safe harbor in sight. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't in the sky, but on the ticker tape at the grain elevator. In January of 1980, President Carter announced an embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union in response to their invasion of Afghanistan. The market, which had been the bedrock of the agricultural boom, vanished overnight. The price of corn, which had been dancing around $3 a bushel, collapsed. It fell through $2.50, then $2, a free fall with no bottom in sight. For Dale Peterson, it was a body blow. His entire operation was a high-stakes gamble predicated on high prices. His operating loan for that year was the largest in the county. A staggering sum meant to cover the diesel for his 8630, the tons of anhydrous ammonia, the sophisticated herbicides, and the payments on $500,000 of land debt. He'd already bought his inputs for the spring at the old high prices. Now, the projected income to pay for it all had been cut in half. At the co-op, his booming confidence was replaced by a brittle, defensive anger. "It's temporary," he'd insist to anyone who would listen, his voice a little too loud. "A political game. The market will bounce back. You've got to have faith." But his eyes were haunted. For Silas, the price drop was painful, but not catastrophic. His costs were a fraction of Dale's. He'd bought his seed corn and fertilizer last fall, with cash, locking in a discount. His fuel bill was manageable. The old 4020 and 4010 were thirsty, but not insatiable like Dale's articulated beast. He wouldn't make much money this year, might even dip into his savings a little, but he wouldn't be borrowing to put a crop in the ground. Then the sky turned against them. The spring rains were sparse, and by June the ground was cracked and dry. The corn, which should have been shoulder-high, was stunted and pale, its leaves curling in on themselves during the heat of the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. The drought of 1980 settled over the heartland like a suffocating blanket. Silas watched his crops struggle, a familiar ache in his heart. He could do nothing about the rain, but he could control his machines. He cultivated his rows, breaking up the hard crust of the soil to help what little moisture there was soak in. The 4020 ran from dawn to dusk, its engine a steady, reliable drone. It was old, but he knew its every secret. One sweltering afternoon in July, as Silas was working a field near the road, he saw Dale's 8630 sitting idle in the middle of a pass, a dark stain spreading on the dry earth beneath it. Dale was standing beside it, his hands on his hips, staring at the massive rear axle. Silas pulled his 4020 onto the headland and walked over. "Trouble?" Silas asked, keeping his voice neutral. Dale kicked one of the giant tires, a gesture of pure frustration. "Final drive," he spat, the word tasting like poison. Heard a pop, then a grinding sound. "Now she won't move. Look at this." He pointed to the puddle of thick, dark gear oil. Something let go inside the planetary hub. "You know what the dealer wants, just to come out here and look at it? $400. And the parts? Hell, the mechanic on the phone said it could be $5,000, maybe $10,000 to fix." Silas looked at the enormous, complex piece of machinery. It was a world away from the simple bull gears in his own tractors. This required specialized tools, a heavy-duty crane, and a mechanic who understood the intricate dance of sun gears and planetary pinions. It wasn't something a man could fix in his own shed with a set of wrenches and a chain hoist. "That's a tough break, Dale," Silas said. And he meant it. "Tough break?" Dale laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "This is a catastrophe. I've got payments on this thing that would choke a horse, and it's sitting here dead while my crop is burning up. I'm already behind with the bank. I can't afford this. I can't afford not to afford this." He looked at Silas, at his sweat-stained shirt and grease-rimmed fingernails, and for the first time, the mockery in his eyes was gone. It was replaced by something else, something that looked terrifyingly like desperation. "You were right, weren't you?" Dale said, his voice barely a whisper. "All this new iron. It's just a prettier cage." Silas didn't answer. He just nodded grimly. He couldn't help Dale fix his tractor, and he knew Dale wouldn't ask for money. There was nothing to do but walk back to his own machine, the familiar, simple machine he understood, and get back to work. As he drove away, the sight of the silent green monster, crippled in the middle of a dying field, was a more potent symbol of the changing times than any headline in the paper. The cracks in Dale Peterson's empire were no longer hidden. They were split wide open for the whole world to see. The fall of 1980 brought a meager harvest and rock-bottom prices. It was a losing year for everyone, but it was the winter that delivered the killing blow. Paul Volcker and the Federal Reserve, in their relentless war on inflation, jacked up the prime interest rate. It climbed past 15%, then 18%. By the spring of 1981, It peaked at a soul-crushing 21.5%. For farmers like Dale Peterson, who lived on credit, it was a death sentence. The variable rate on his operating loan, the one he had bragged about just a few years earlier, was now a ticking time bomb. The interest on his debt was compounding faster than his crops could grow. The letters from the bank started arriving, first polite, then demanding, then threatening. The whole community was seized by a quiet panic. The talk at the cafe was no longer about yields and land prices, but about interest rates and foreclosure notices. Friends of a lifetime started avoiding each other's eyes, ashamed of their own struggles, fearful of their neighbors. The optimistic spirit of the 70s curdled into the grim despair of the 80s. Dale fought like a cornered animal. He sold his new pickup truck and started driving an old, rust-eaten Ford. He sold his small herd of cattle at a loss. He tried to get a second mortgage on his land, but the bank, seeing the collapsing land values, refused. The land he had bought for $3,000 an acre was now barely worth half that on paper, and there were no buyers. He was trapped. The very assets that had made him look so wealthy were now the anchors dragging him under. Silas, meanwhile, was weathering the storm. His savings account, which had seemed so foolishly conservative during the boom, was now his lifeline. It allowed him to buy his seed and fuel without going to the bank. The drought had eased, and he focused on what he could control, his expenses. He parked the 4010 and did all his work with the more fuel-efficient 4020. He started a small side business doing repair work for his neighbors, fixing their aging equipment because they couldn't afford the dealership's shop rates. He'd work on their tractors late into the night in his shed, his payment often being a share of their crop or a side of beef. He was surviving, not with grand financial maneuvers, but with calloused hands and a deep understanding of his machinery. The day of Dale Peterson's farm auction was cold and grey, a miserable day in March of 1982. The wind whipped across the barren fields, carrying with it a sense of profound loss. The yard was filled with pickup trucks and cars, but the mood was not of a festive gathering, but of a funeral. Neighbors stood in small, quiet groups, their faces grim. They were there to pick over the bones of a fallen friend, but they knew, in their hearts, that it could just as easily be them next. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant, usually a sound of commerce and opportunity, felt like a judgment. Dale's life was being sold off, piece by piece. His tools, his grain wagons, his planter, his combine. The magnificent 8630, its final drive finally repaired at a ruinous cost, sold for less than a third of what he had paid for it. Silas stood at the back of the crowd, a silent witness. He didn't bid on anything. This was not a moment for triumph. It was a tragedy, for Dale and for the entire community. Dale stood near the porch of the farmhouse his wife's family had built, his face a stony mask, but Silas could see the tremor in his hands. His wife, Sarah, was inside, refusing to watch the dismantling of their world. When the auctioneer finally moved to the land itself, a heavy silence fell over the crowd. The banker, a man in a suit who looked out of place in the muddy farmyard, read the legal descriptions. They sold the 200 acres Dale had bought on contract first. Then they moved to the last parcel, the original 160 acres, the home place. The bidding was slow, hesitant. No one wanted to be the one to take a neighbor's home. The banker grew impatient, trying to coax the bids higher. Silas felt a knot in his chest. This wasn't right. He saw Dale flinch with every bid, another piece of his identity being stripped away. And in that moment, Silas Miller, the man who hated debt and shunned risk, did the most daring thing of his life. He stepped forward, his voice clear and steady in the cold air. He made a bid, a fair one, just above the last. The crowd turned to look at him, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. The banker, surprised, looked to Dale's creditor for a nod, got it, and then pointed at Silas. "Sold!" the auctioneer cried, his gavel falling with a sickening finality. The crowd dispersed quickly after that, leaving Silas alone in the yard with the banker and Dale Peterson. The banker, all business, arranged to meet Silas the next day to sign the papers. He would be paying cash, drawing down the savings he had so carefully accumulated over the last decade. When the banker was gone, only Silas and Dale remained. Dale wouldn't look at him. He just stared at the ground, a broken man. "Why, Silas?" Dale finally asked, his voice rough with unshed tears. "After all the grief I gave you. After everything. Why would you do this?" Silas looked not at Dale, but at the old farmhouse, the windbreak of pine trees his grandfather had planted, the barn with its faded red paint. He looked at the land, the rich, dark soil that had sustained families for generations. "Because this land shouldn't belong to a bank in Des Moines," Silas said quietly. "It should be farmed by a Peterson. I'm not taking your home, Dale. I'm just holding it for you. You can rent it from me. A simple crop share lease. No interest, no bankers. Just you, me, and the land. We'll work out the details when you're ready." Dale finally looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. The pride, the arrogance, the anger, it all washed away, leaving only a raw, vulnerable humanity. He couldn't speak. He just nodded, a single, jerky motion, and turned and walked back into the house, his shoulders slumped not just with defeat, but with the bewildering weight of unearned grace. The news of what Silas had done spread through the county like wildfire. The narrative that had followed him for years, Silas the stubborn, Silas the old-fashioned, Silas the man afraid of progress, was rewritten overnight. At the co-op and the cafe, they spoke his name with a new kind of respect, a quiet awe. He hadn't just survived the crisis, he had transcended it. He had proven that wealth wasn't measured by the size of your tractor or the number of acres on your loan application, but by the freedom to act on your convictions, to extend a hand when others were turning away. Smitty, the dealership manager who had once pitied him, came out to the farm one day, ostensibly to sell him some filters, but really just to shake his hand and say, "You saw it coming, Silas. You saw it all coming." Life settled into a new rhythm. Dale and his family stayed in their home. He farmed his original quarter section as Silas's tenant, using older, smaller equipment he bought for cash at other, sadder auctions. The two men, once rivals, became cautious friends, bonded by the shared love of the land and the hard lessons of the crisis. Dale's swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet humility and a deep, abiding gratitude. The 1980s were lean years, but Silas's farm remained an island of stability. His two old tractors, the 4010 and the 4020, became local legends. They were symbols of his foresight, their steady diesel drone a testament to the power of self-reliance. He never got big. He never bought a four-wheel drive or built a fancy new machine shed. He continued to live by his father's simple creed: if you can't pay cash, you can't afford it. Years turned into decades. The farm economy slowly recovered. Land prices began to creep back up. Silas grew older, his hair turning from brown to grey, his hands becoming more gnarled, but his spirit remained as steadfast as the oak trees lining his lane. One bright, crisp autumn afternoon, long after the great crisis had passed into memory, Silas's grandson, a boy of 16 named Jacob, was helping him in the shop. They were working on the 4020, giving it its annual tune-up before putting it away for the winter. The tractor's green paint was faded and chipped, but its engine was clean, its mechanics perfectly maintained. "Grandpa," Jacob asked, wiping grease from a fuel injector with a clean rag. "Why didn't you ever buy a new tractor? One with a cab and air conditioning and a radio?" Silas stopped turning his wrench and looked at the boy. He saw the same curiosity in his eyes that he had once felt himself. He gestured to the tractor's engine. "You see this?" Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "This is honest. It's just steel and iron and diesel fuel. I can understand it. When it breaks, I can feel it. I can hear it. And with a little sweat, I can fix it right here in this shed. The new ones, they're full of computers and wires I can't read. When they break, you've got to call a man with a laptop, and he sends you a bill that looks like a phone number." He leaned against the tractor's big rear tire, the rubber worn but still sound. "But it's more than that, son," he continued. "This tractor never sent me a bill in the mail. It never charged me interest. It never threatened to take my home. It asked for fuel and oil and grease, and in return, it gave me a living. It gave me freedom. See, the world will always try to sell you a bigger, faster, shinier dream. They'll tell you that you've got to have it, that you can pay for it later. But later always comes. Debt is a chain, and the man who holds that chain, he's the one who's truly in charge." Silas picked up his wrench again and pointed to a bolt on the injector pump. "Now hand me that 9/16. Let's get the timing just right." Jacob handed him the wrench, his young mind turning over the old man's words. He looked at the venerable tractor, then at his grandfather's weathered face, and he began to understand. The real legacy wasn't just the land, free and clear. It was the wisdom that came with it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the machine shed floor, the quiet clink of steel on steel was the only sound, a simple, honest rhythm that had sustained a family and a way of life against the changing tides of the world. The old iron would endure.